Yeah, it's been a while since I've preached a sermon. It's been like a month, and I love preaching, and so I've missed it. We joke. I have some people who give me a hard time, and they're thinking that I'm probably just starving for attention right now because I haven't been able to be up here, And so I'm not really, maybe a little bit, who knows. I do enjoy this. I enjoy preaching. But I'm really thankful to serve in a church with other wonderful preachers, and so that means I can take a few weeks off if I need to. This past year has been hard for me. Has it been hard for you all? I think it's been hard for most of us. It's been really hard for me to continue to come up with things to preach on every week, just to be honest. Sometimes I feel like 2020 was like crisis mode. And I was like, stuff was like coming all the time because we're just trying to survive and we just got to hear from God. But I feel like the law and kind of the depressive nature of 2021 has taken its toll on me. I've been through a lot this year. And so as much as I love preaching, there's been times where my mind and my spirit have felt kind of cloudy. Do y'all ever feel like that? And it's really just hard to kind of see and hear from God. And so with that being said, though, I'm excited to be back to preaching today. And I want to thank you all for being a church that allows your pastor to take breaks if needed. And I'm just grateful that we have other wonderful people that you all can hear from. It makes us stronger to have many different voices up here, I believe. I'm really excited about what I have planned to share with you today. Last week, Christina preached on a woman named Rahab, and we read about her story in Joshua. And it was a really powerful sermon about, bringing those on the outside to the center, and that's really at God's heart, and certainly at the heart of Jesus and his ministry. And during the sermon, afterwards, I talked to my friend and co-laborer over here, Jackie J., and Jackie said that her mind was just going crazy during the sermon, drawing all kinds of connections. And y'all may not know this, but Jackie knows a lot about the ancient world. That's like her specialty. She's an Egyptologist and has studied this stuff and teaches it at EKU. And so she knows a lot about the culture and history in the ancient world. And her insights, as we talked, were just so enlightening to me and really inspired me. And so my message this morning is kind of inspired through a conversation I had with Jackie last week. And so, Jackie, you're going to hear some things that you probably already know this morning, but I wanted to share some of this with the rest of the church because it's really profound stuff that's really impacted the way I read the Bible. So, and I think it'll speak to these stories, the mothers of Jesus, these stories of these women that we've been talking about, and talk about really why they're so important and why we need to read these stories and what do they have to do with Jesus. So, in his book about the Bible, the author and speaker, Rob Bell, asked this question, and I really love some of his insights, and so I think this question is an important question for all of us to think about. What's the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible? What's the best question that you can ask when you're reading the Bible? Now, that's a hard question to answer, but I think it's something that we have to think about. When we're reading the Bible, when we open it up, what kinds of questions ought we to ask when we're reading this? And his advice is to start with this question. Why did people find this important to write down in the first place? When you're reading anything in the Bible, it is important to ask, why did these authors decide to write this down? Why did people feel the need to write about this stuff? Most of stories in the ancient world were passed down through the oral tradition. They didn't have a printing press like we have today. It would have taken great time and effort and resources to actually write down these books on documents that we can hold on to. They would tell stories out loud, and they took these stories very seriously, and they sought to remember them, and they would pass them on from generation to generation to generation. In hundreds of years, they would hold on to these stories through the oral tradition. And so we need to ask the question, why did the authors of these books finally decide they wanted to take these stories that have been told aloud and decide to write them down? What about these stories made them worthy to put into their Hebrew Bible, into their sacred scriptures? So if we think about the story of Rahab from last week, for instance, we should ask the question, why did the Israelites decide to write this story about this Canaanite woman, this story about a prostitute from a foreign land who showed God's love and kindness to Israelite spies? This story about an outsider being brought to the center. Why did they want to tell this story? Or thinking about the story of Ruth from this week. There's a whole book named after Ruth in the Bible. We should ask the question, why did the Israelites decide to write this story? Particularly a story about a woman. There are very few books of the Bible named after women where that is the sole characters in the story, right? So why did the Israelites decide to write this story about a woman, a Moabite widow, where the hero is a poor woman from an enemy nation? Why would they want to write this story down? Why did they need to tell these stories? Why did they break with their kind of male-dominated, Jewish-centered traditions and tell stories where the heroes are foreign women from enemy nations? You know, this past year, I've learned something new, and some of you all may have known this for a long time, but I learned this and I'd never really considered it before. And it's radically influenced the way that I've read and understood, particularly the Old Testament. And here it is. Much of the Old Testament, if not most of the Old Testament, was written down during or directly after the Babylonian exile. And so some of these stories were hundreds of years old, and they finally decided to put it all together in what we now have. We call it the Old Testament. We could also call it the Hebrew Bible. Why did they decide to put it all down during this time, during or directly after the exile? They likely had various fragments and documents of these stories. They had their old traditions. And these stories were sacred to them. And they held on to them for hundreds of years before they decided to actually write them down and put them in their Bible. Let me give you a very simplified history of the Israelites, because I think this is helpful for us. Because some of you all may not know what the exile is and where that fits into the history of the Old Testament. And so this is going to be a very, very simplified history of the Israelites up to the exile. But I'll just throw some things there on the screen. So first, it starts with creation in Genesis, right? Read about Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the fall, all of that. Then eventually we move to this guy named Noah and his big family, and God sent the flood, and there was the ark, and then Noah's kind of extended family and connections. They were on the ark, and then eventually they came off and repopulated the earth. Then we read about the patriarchs, this guy named Abraham, Father Abraham, right? We have songs about this guy. He was told he was going to be the father of a great nation. He had kids, they had kids. We eventually come to a guy named Jacob who has to take his family to Egypt because there was a famine in their land. And so the whole family went to Egypt, and things started out okay, but eventually the Egyptians grew tired of these Israelites, and they began to oppress them and enslave them. Then we come to the Exodus, where God showed up in a powerful way and sent the plagues, and Moses was raised up. Probably my favorite story in the whole Bible, where God comes in and he sides with the oppressed and he sets the people free. And they exit, right? They leave Egypt walking to freedom. Then they didn't have a home. They didn't have a place to go, and so they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That's when we get the 10 Commandments and the law, and they start to kind of form themselves as a community. And then eventually they enter into the promised land. Joshua is where we read about this. That's where Rahab's story comes into play that Christina talked about last week. Then eventually they decided we need people to govern us, to rule us. They weren't supposed to have a king because they believed God was king, and so they appointed judges to rule them. Turns out the judges were not very good leaders. Almost all of them were awful, and they were terrible leaders. It was a very dark time in Israel's history, and this is where Ruth's story comes in during the time of the judges. Eventually, they beg God for a king, and God finally he finally relents and gives them a king. And so they have their first king, King Saul, then David, and then Solomon. This was the unified monarchy, the unified kingdom, and probably one of the strongest moments as a nation, at least for Israel. Now, eventually, after Solomon, they have some conflict, and the nation splits into two. You have the northern and the southern kingdom, and that's the divided kingdom. And there were many, many kings throughout this period. Almost all of them were bad kings. There were a few exceptions. The prophets were very active towards the end of this period, calling Israel to repent, calling them to get right with God, speaking truth to power, but they weren't really listening, and eventually the Israelites fell to some of the surrounding powers that were around them. The northern kingdom fell. Eventually the southern kingdom fell, and they went into exile. The Babylonian Empire came in, destroyed everything. They practiced a scorched earth policy. They would go and burn up the fields. They would just decimated Palestine, and many of them were forced to leave. They were deported from their own land, and some of them remained, but this was where we come to the exile, the most traumatic moment in Israel's history. The temple was destroyed, just a really, really earth-shattering event. And so most of this history that I've given you was finally written down after the exile. They experienced this traumatic, earth-shattering tragedy, and they decided in that moment that they needed to revisit their history, revisit their calling, their values, put them down on paper so they would never forget. They did some soul searching. They asked hard questions and decided they needed to retell their story again, to lay it all out so that they could get back on track and stay focused for many more generations. So something to know is that directly before the exile, during the exile, and after the exile, there was a lot of prophetic activity. There were many prophets that God raised up. Some of them we know their names. I'm sure there's many we don't know. And these prophets spoke truth to power, they provoked the comfortable, and they called the Israelites to repent and get right with God and get right with each other. And they also cast a vision for a better way of living. As Walter Brueggemann says, the prophets would criticize and they would energize. They were very critical people. Many people would probably think you're too critical, right? All you're doing is calling out the negative things. And they did that. Because they needed to. They needed to tell about the ways people had screwed up. But they also energized and they inspired people towards a new and fresh vision. And one book in the Bible, the book of Isaiah, it's a fascinating book. It's a very long book in the Bible. It provides prophecy for us that covers this entire period that we're speaking about. Pre-exile, during the exile, and post-exile. All right? So when Babylon conquered the Israelites, they deported most of them and they scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire. And eventually Babylon was conquered by the Persians, and the Israelites were eventually allowed to return home. Now, there were prophets at that time that were warning people of the coming destruction. They saw it. They said, I see what's happening here. There are signs that something bad is coming. The way we're treating people is not right. The way that we're just allowing these awful leaders to gain control and power over us is not right. And they were calling people out and pointing out that something bad is coming. And they were right. Something bad did happen. And the prophets continued to speak out during the exile, when the destruction happened. And then there were prophets who tried after all of this to help the Israelites envision a new way, to heal, to repair, and to move forward. I can give you a more modern example. We can think about the rise of fascism and Nazism in Germany. It's a story that many of us know about, right? It's common to our history. There were certainly modern-day prophets that were warning people of what was coming. Fascism doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Right? There are lots of decisions that are made over a long period of time to get them to that point. And there were prophets who spoke up about these things, who said, y'all need to pay attention. What's happening here is not okay. Once the Nazi Party took power, there were still prophets who were speaking truth to power during that time. And it was a very dangerous thing to do. Many of y'all probably know Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There were others like him who were speaking truth to power, speaking things that could get you in big trouble for saying. There were also those providing comfort to the afflicted and the persecuted. Once Nazism was defeated, there were prophets that were helping make sense of what happened, working to repair the damage, and casting a vision for a better future. We have a whole description of how all this was taking place within the Israelite community many, many years ago in the book of Isaiah. And at the end of Isaiah, we get to a section that many people call Third Isaiah, and we read a vision about a new Israel after exile. And this vision of a new Israel after exile would truly reflect God's desire for their nation. And Jackie pointed this out to me, but the Wonder Room has a description of Third Isaiah that goes like this, and it's beautiful. It says, "Lift up your eyes and look around. Everyone is coming home. God will gather all the people of the world close, just like a mother does when she gathers her children close." I love that. Lift up your eyes and look around. Everybody's coming home. God will gather all the people of the world close, just as a mother does when she gathers her children close. The last chapter of Isaiah ends the book with a beautiful description of God reaching out to all of the people of the earth and bringing them all close. Isaiah ends with this just powerful, inclusive vision for Israel. It's a vision of Israel being open to non-Jews, to those who are far off, even from people from enemy nations. From the beginning, the Israelites were called and chosen for the purpose of being a blessing to all the earth. Go all the way back to Abraham's story. That was there from the beginning. So after the exile, the Israelites were coming home. They had faced many choices. How were they going to live together? Now think about it. You had this mixed group of people who were all scattered all across the empire, and they were coming back to their homeland. Many people certainly married people of other ethnic groups. There were mixed families. Some people remained in Palestine, but others were forced to leave. And so you had remainers and you had returners. You had this mixed multitude of people, and they were all coming together. And they had to ask some hard questions, you can imagine. How are we going to live together? How are we going to form our community and live life with one another? Will we be open and will we be inclusive, or will we be closed and exclusive? Will we be open to a new thing that God is doing? Will we listen to the prophecies? Or will we cling to past rigidity and isolationism? I imagine there were many folks who felt like they needed to kind of cleanse Israel or purify Israel, kick out the foreigners, outlaw intermarriage with other ethnic groups, force upon people oppressive laws and regulations. And there were folks who believed those things. However, there were others, like the prophet Isaiah, who called the people to see God's vision to be a blessing to all the nations, and he called them to see it coming to fruition right in front of them, right before their eyes. The prophet saw that moment in their history as a foretaste of what would come in its fullness in the future. So how does this connect to Rahab, this Canaanite prostitute, or Ruth, this Moabite widow? Well, it's very likely that the books of Joshua and Ruth were written right after the exile. During this moment of great decision over inclusivity versus exclusivity, some Israelites felt the need to record permanently the stories of these powerful foreign women, Rahab and Ruth. Both women married Israelites. They were foreign women who married into the Israelite family. Both women clearly represent God's desire to be a blessing to all the world. God's desire for equity and inclusion and justice. Now keep in mind that Rahab's story and Ruth's story, they actually happened hundreds of years before the exile. However, these writers of these stories went back to their traditions. They went back to these stories that had been told for hundreds of years, and they found useful and powerful stories that could help steer the Israelites in a more inclusive and others-oriented path. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but this is what we call Sankofa, right? It's going back and finding what is useful from our past to help guide us into the future. Then we come to Matthew. A few hundred years later, the Gospel of Matthew. Fast forward, the exile, they return from exile a few hundred more years, then we come to Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew wrote a genealogy of Jesus, and he stuck with the normal pattern of describing the men who came before Jesus. But at 5 critical places, he changes the script. he mentions 5 powerful women. And the question we ought to ask is, why did Matthew put these women in Jesus' genealogy? Why did he do this when they never put women in genealogies back then? It was very radical. It was out of the norm. It would have been scandalous. He's trying to communicate something here. He's trying to draw our attention to these stories because we need to learn from them. 2 of the women are Rahab and Ruth. I believe Matthew wanted their legacy to live on. Matthew wanted people to see that Jesus follows in the footsteps of these immigrant women. Matthew's entire gospel is about God's heart for all the people. It's about Jesus' ministry of breaking boundaries, including those who were previously excluded, and making heroes out of the forgotten. Rahab and Ruth's stories came back to life for people returning from exile, and they needed to hear those stories, inspiring them to be more open and loving of people who were different than them. And Rahab's and Ruth's stories came back to life again for Matthew's audience. Matthew was writing to the early Christians when he wrote his gospel because they were trying to debate whether they were going to include Gentiles or not, whether they were going to continue Jesus' path of empowering women and children and others who had been excluded. And Matthew's audience needed to hear Ruth and Rahab's stories so that they could be invited to a different way of living. And I think Rahab and Ruth's stories ought to come back to life for us today. Some would say we are at a critical moment in our history, not just in America, but all across our world. We're seeing a rise in authoritarianism, fascism, racism, bigotry, hate. We're witnessing this climate catastrophe that is disproportionately impacting poor people of color across our globe. Elected representatives in our federal government are consistently attacking, vilifying, and demonizing brilliant women of color in our government. I can't get over the fact something has just been in my brain and I can't get it out. Something that happened when our troops were being withdrawn from Afghanistan. We made apparently an accident and we sent a drone missile right into a car in a neighborhood, taking the lives of children even who were completely innocent and had done nothing wrong. And they made an apology about it and said, we made a mistake. And those weren't the people we were supposed to kill with the missile. We are at a critical moment. We are at a critical moment. Trans people and gay people and queer people are being constantly hounded and harassed and vilified, even by self-proclaiming Christians, sometimes more so by self-proclaiming Christians. Rahab and Ruth's stories, along with Bathsheba and Tamar and Mary, remind us that every single person across the globe has intrinsic dignity and value and worth. The child in Afghanistan has just as much worth and value and dignity as the child of a billionaire in America. The more we grow to understand this, to believe it, to live into it, the more we become like God, because this is how God sees us. And then the more we grow into this and believe it and understand it and live into it, the more joy we will have in our lives. You know, looking back over the course of my adult life, I can say with confidence that the one thing that has brought me more joy than most everything else is my friendships, my connections, living life among people who are different than me. As I've listened and learned from my friends from other races, countries, from friends who don't fit into what our culture says is normal, my friends who have very different life experiences than me, I've been challenged, I've been convicted, and often made very uncomfortable at times. I've learned a lot about myself, my prejudice, my biases, my blind spots, my arrogance, my privilege, and I'm still learning. I've got a long journey ahead of me, and it's been hard, it's been difficult, and at times I've wanted to retreat inside of myself and just stick with people who think like me and look like me and live like me, but God keeps pushing me into risky territory. And I can tell you that it's all been worth it because my joy has only increased as I've been better able to learn to love all people. I've been spending a lot of time recently working with the board of Neighbors Immigration Clinic, which is our nonprofit immigration clinic that we partner with that meets in our church upstairs. And it's been hard work. It's been difficult, at times painful. However, I do it because I know that it's God's heart to love and care for immigrants, to accompany immigrants in our community on their journey to find wholeness and flourishing for themselves and their families. And I also do it because it brings me so much joy. You know, if you know the story of Ruth, you know that Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, she was an Israelite. She experienced deep depression and bitterness and pain after the loss of her husband and her 2 sons. And she opened herself up to this deep, what became this intimate friendship with her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And Ruth was a Moabite. The Israelites hated Moabites by and large. They had laws where the Moabites were not allowed to worship with them. They weren't allowed to help out Moabites. But Naomi opened herself up to a friendship, a relationship with Ruth, an enemy of Israel. And through that unlikely friendship, you'll see the journey in the few chapters of Ruth, that they grow together, they face challenges together, they learn together, they scheme together. And Naomi eventually finds joy in her life. You know, we've come to this moment at many points in our history, and we need to ask the question, are we going to close in? Are we going to protect ourselves? Are we going to just stick with people like us, or are we going to embrace this vision that God gives us for an inclusive and peaceful and open community? And I think that, I know for a fact that's the vision that Jesus offers us. Jesus came in the spirit, really, we could say the spirit of 3rd Isaiah. Jesus came to fulfill and bring into the fullness this vision that Isaiah laid out for what Israel ought to be about. And he invited all of us to join into this movement. And so I think we always need to keep this in our minds. And these stories of these women can help us to move in that direction. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.